This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle, or for anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is Matthew 21, verses 1 through 11, and it's the basis for the sermon at First Free Methodist Church on Sunday, March 29, 2026. It's part of our series called Transforming Conflict and How We Can Hold Others in Life's Disruptions. So let's hear the passage beginning at the first verse of Matthew 21. When they had approached Jerusalem and had come to Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, Jesus then sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village opposite you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied there and a colt with it. Untie them and bring them to me. And if anyone says anything to you, you shall say, 'The Lord needs them,' and he will send them on immediately." Now this took place so that what was spoken through the prophet would be fulfilled. "Say to the daughter of Zion, Behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did just as Jesus had instructed them, and brought the donkey and the colt, and laid their cloaks on them. And he sat on the cloaks. Most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others were cutting branches from the trees and spreading them on the road. Now the crowds going ahead of him and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest!" When he had entered Jerusalem, all the city was stirred, saying, "Who is this?" And the crowds were saying, "This is Jesus the prophet, from Nazareth in Galilee."
Of course, this is the classic reading for Palm Sunday, which we observe and celebrate on the Christian calendar as the Sunday prior to Easter. It marks the beginning of Holy Week and the holiest time of year for Christians around the world. This text tells us at the beginning, at least, how Jesus begins to prepare for his journey. It says that he arrives at a town called Bethphage, and Bethphage means house of unripe figs. Every time you see the word Bet in the front of a name of a city, that word Bet in Hebrew means house. So Bethphage, Bethany, Bethlehem, they all start with that same syllable at the very beginning in the Hebrew word for house. So house of unripe figs. Jesus has just ascended the mountains from Jericho on the eastern side of those hills below the city of Jerusalem. It's quite the climb from the Jordan River Valley up from the road through Jericho on all the way up near the summit of the Mount of Olives. And so the city of Bethphage is on the eastern side of the summit of the Mount of Olives. And then one would summit there and then descend down into a very steep but narrow valley and then back up into the actual city of Jerusalem itself. The text tells us that 2 of the disciples go to the village opposite Bethphage, which is more than likely the village of Bethany, to find a donkey there with a colt. Now, perhaps this has already been prearranged by Jesus or not, because Jesus is actually going to return to Bethany that night. One of the things we need to remember about Holy Week is that Jesus never stays overnight in the city of Jerusalem during the entire Holy Week. He travels from Bethany into Jerusalem for the day, does whatever he does during the week. We can read about this in the gospel stories, and then he travels back to Bethany every single night. So the donkey and the colt that Jesus is going to use are going to go into Jerusalem, and then they're going to be returned that very evening. Jesus plans to enter the city from the east, and this is very significant because it was considered to be the way in which the Messiah would enter the city of Jerusalem. And so Jewish expectation is that the Messiah would enter from the east. And there's a prophetic fulfillment in this, that Jesus is standing squarely in the middle of what many people expected the Messiah would do. In this way, Jesus is purposeful in his actions, the choices he makes, the animal he chooses to ride on, how he's going to enter the city of Jerusalem. He intends to be clear. Now, the animal that Jesus chooses to ride on is critical, and this is very important. Not only is it a fulfillment of Scripture, but culturally speaking, The donkey is to be contrasted with the stallion. The stallion, of course, horse, would be ridden by a general or some other military leader. It exudes power, whereas the donkey is an animal of humility. It was tradition in the ancient world that when two armies were battling against one another, and the two leaders of those armies wanted to have a conference together or to parlay about maybe a ceasefire or something else, that they would ride into the open battlefield on donkeys. And that was the way they would signal to the other general that they did not come to fight, but they came in peace with the hopes of having some negotiation or conversation together. So the choice of the animal Jesus rides is clear, that if he were to have entered Jerusalem riding on the back of a horse or some kind of stallion, it would have communicated that Jesus comes as a warrior to make war, to bring a battle into the city of Jerusalem. But instead, he rides a donkey, an animal of peace and engagement. And this is a key passageway for us here that we must pay attention to when we read this story. And it's this: authenticity is most important when expectations run high. Jesus knows exactly what his actions mean and what his actions will precipitate. He is clear. He also knows that his followers and many of the inhabitants of Jerusalem are looking for a military or a regal kind of Messiah. Jesus shows us at the most pivotal moment that authenticity matters. When people are expecting something often from us, we need to follow Jesus' example here and to deliver not what people expect, but we need to deliver exactly who we are. That is, being a child of God, adopted by grace, called to love others in Jesus' name. This authenticity at the pivotal moment when expectations are high is one of the most important characteristics for the followers of Jesus to learn how to cultivate and develop in their lives. The text then leans into this space now of the journey that Jesus actually makes. There's this fulfillment of prophecy. There's this way in which the donkey is an expression of humility, that Jesus comes in peace. And so as the journey begins, the disciples go to the village opposite Bethphage, probably Bethany, and of course they find the donkey and the colt tied up exactly as Jesus describes them. It says that Jesus mounts them. The language here in Matthew is a little confusing because it almost sounds like Jesus is riding two animals at the same time. It was quite likely that the colt was not yet broken from its mother or weaned from its mother, and so both of the animals had to ride or had to move together rather than separately as they entered the city of Jerusalem. Now there was a crowd that placed cloaks and branches on the road. And all of these things that they do are important elements of what's happening here on this first Palm Sunday procession. The cloaks that are placed on the animal and placed into the road, that was a way in which culturally you would signal submission, that you would take this cloak or the article of your outermost article of your clothing and lay it on the ground, and a person would walk over it or step over it. It was a way of signifying your submission to that person as they came. The branches that were cut from trees, take note that Matthew doesn't say anything about palms. It just simply says branches from trees. But in other gospel accounts, we know these also to be palms. These are symbols of Jewish nationalism. Keep in mind that the notion of them having a flag or a standard that represented their nation didn't come for centuries later. And so every culture had a different way of kind of symbolizing or representing their national identity. And for the Jewish people, it was these palm branches that they would wave. It's somewhat the equivalent of waving around an American flag on a 4th of July parade. They shout Hosanna, which literally means save us. It's a cry or an exclamation to God. And it's also a word of praise for the Messiah. There's this expectation that this Messiah would save us, would come as a liberator. So them shouting Hosanna toward Jesus is a way in which they would expect to express their praise to the Messiah himself. And then ultimately they say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. This blessed is he is also a word used, or a sequencing of words that are used as an acclaim for the Messiah, that there is this blessing for the one who comes to liberate the Jewish people. We need to make sure we also understand here when we read this text that Jesus' entry into Jerusalem is not one in which crowds lined up along the road and he passed by them the way we would think commonly of a parade. No, instead, he mounts the donkey, and a crowd surrounds him and moves with him. And so it looks more like an amoeba moving along down this road that comes from the top of the Mount of Olives, which is the hill exactly to the east of the city of Jerusalem, with a steep, narrow valley that lies between those two. And so Jesus begins his descent from the Mount of Olives down into this valley called the Kidron Valley, and then up steeply into the city of Jerusalem. This valley is not very wide at all. If you've ever been to the city of Jerusalem or have had the opportunity to see even photographs taken of the eastern side of the city, this valley can't be more than half a mile, a third of a mile wide, all the way from one peak to the other peak. It's very, very narrow and very, very steep. See, the Messiah is supposed to enter the city of Jerusalem according to Jewish expectations then, and even Jewish expectations today, through the east gate of the city. This is well known amongst other religions, and Jerusalem has been a city that has been under siege in terms of a religious siege for centuries. And so during the days in which the city of Jerusalem was being traded between Muslim and Christians and Jews, the Muslim community built a cemetery in front of the east gate because they know it causes a Jewish person to be unclean if they set foot in a cemetery. So in other words, they built a cemetery, and it's still there to this day in front of the east gate as a blockade for any so-called Messiah that might want to try to enter the city. Now, the crowd that's there on this particular day assumes this is the advent of the Messiah who's come to lead the Jewish people to independence and to liberate them from Roman rule. But again, Jesus is clear in his actions. There's no confusion. He comes as the Messiah. He's explicit about who he is as he enters the city. It opens a key passageway for us here that we must pay attention to, that Jesus invites our praise and worship as a way of transformation, as this crowd proclaims their praises to him by shouting, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." This disconnect is real in this story. See, what Jesus brings and what the crowd wants are two different things. Being the Messiah is not the question. You see, on this, Jesus and the crowd agree. Jesus is making an explicit statement that he is the Messiah who has come to the city of Jerusalem, and the crowd agrees with that. But the scope and the nature of that Messiah are varied. It's at that point they disagree. The crowd expects a new Jewish ruler. And in some ways, so does Jesus. But the meaning of that is completely different. So Jesus welcomes their praise and adoration. But that praise and adoration the crowd offer is misguided. They're pointing to the Messiah correctly, but they're not understanding the implications, the scope, the nature of who Jesus is as this Messiah. And so we must never assume that we're wrong to praise and worship Jesus, even when we ourselves are misguided or misunderstanding of what Jesus is doing and how Jesus is at work. Jesus welcomes all exactly as we are, right where we are. Illumination will come later. It'll become clear to the city the nature of Jesus' messiahship. That'll come. But let's not make the mistake of thinking that we have to understand and know Jesus correctly before we can praise and worship him. We're always going to be in this space of not quite having it figured out, not knowing who Jesus is fully, even in our own lives. But that should not stop us from offering praise. Jesus welcomes the praise the crowd offers, even though he knows it's just a little bit misguided. And so we come to the close of the story as Jesus enters the city of Jerusalem. He comes down the steep hillside from the Mount of Olives to the bottom of the Kidron Valley and then up steeply through the east gate into the city of Jerusalem. It says in this text that the city was stirred when Jesus entered it. In my translation, the New American Standard Bible, it says the city was stirred, saying, "Who is this?" That word for stirred that the translators use there is not really the strongest word that they need to be using here. This is the same Greek word that's used for earthquake. And so it's not that the city was just stirred, it's that the city is in complete upheaval. This is a massive event that in many ways seismically disturbs the entire city as Jesus enters into it. Why? Because the timing of Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem is so important. He arrives in Jerusalem before the Passover begins. The Passover is the Jewish celebration of their liberation from slavery in Egypt. Passover, in many ways, is the equivalent of the 4th of July for Americans. And the Jewish patriotic fervor is running at a fever pitch when Jesus enters into the city of Jerusalem. The timing of his arrival could not be better for a Messiah, but it could not be worse for the authorities that govern the city. Now, see, while Jesus enters the city from the east on a colt, and we've talked a lot about him entering the city from the east, this is important because at the same day, at the same time, Roman soldiers and garrisons were entering the city from the west. They were coming from Caesarea Maritima. This is where the Roman governor who oversaw the entire region was based, and that was out at the shore of the Mediterranean Sea. And so from the Roman headquarters, Caesarea Maritima, the Roman governor, in this case Pilate, along with garrisons of Roman soldiers, are now coming into the city from the east. So at the same time, there's this collision of these two great powers in the city, Jesus entering from the east, the Romans entering from the west. The Romans will ride stallions as they come into the city as a show of their power to the Jews. What they want to make sure is that the Jewish citizens of Jerusalem don't get any bright ideas. They want to have a show of Roman power so that the city won't get any radical ideas of having some kind of insurrection or rebellion against Roman rule. It's at this moment that Jesus enters the city at the same time. The contrast between empire through the Romans and the reign of God is clear. Romans and Jesus are colliding in the city. And so the choice offered to the city is now clear enough. The city asked who Jesus was. Well, now they know. That opens the final key passageway for us. That the reign of God confronts human powers and principalities. You see, the collision of Jesus and the Romans in the city of Jerusalem is clear, and it will come to a head by Friday morning. That same crowd that shouted hosannas on Palm Sunday will shout crucify him 5 short days later on Friday. Why? Because Jesus refuses to deliver on their expectations. Remember, they expect a regal or a military Messiah, but Jesus has made clear he comes in peace. He comes in to usher in a different type of age that those in Jerusalem were not really prepared to listen to. By Friday morning, he's been arrested, he's been beaten. He is in every way, to the Romans and to the Jews in the city, he is proven as a loser. And so the crowds and the most of the disciples that shouted Hosanna, they abandon him by Friday. What's interesting in this key passageway is that while God is defeating empire, and the empire is not the Roman Empire, but the empire of sin and death, he, Jesus, looks like he himself is being defeated. While God is defeating empire, God looks like God is being defeated by it. This is the foolishness of the gospel, that their intent of defeat, the way in which they seek to kill Jesus by the end of the week is exactly what God uses to defeat the power of sin and death. This is the Christian gospel, this proclamation of the good news of Jesus, that even in the moments in which it looks most bleak for the work and mission of God, it's exactly in that moment that God's power and strength are really the greatest.
Thank you for listening to the FFMC podcast. Listen in for our sermon podcast and our conversational podcast called Connections. You can find them right here in the FFMC podcast. I also encourage you to visit our website at ffmc.org to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.